Hi everyone, we're gonna get started. First of all, thank you so much for being here. I'd like to first introduce myself. My name is Katie Mantel, and I'm part of the board of directors of Also Known As. For those who don't know, Also Known As is a nonprofit organization based here in New York City, and our mission is to build a community that empowers the voices of adult international adoptees while providing resources and space to acknowledge the loss of birth country, culture, language, and biological family. I'm so thrilled to welcome you all here tonight to celebrate When We Become Ours, a YA Adoptee Anthology, edited by Nicole, Chung, and Shannon Gibney. I also just want to say a quick thank you to the Asian American Writers Workshop for so graciously sponsoring tonight's event and hosting us here. This could not have happened without them, especially to Devin right here. So thank you so much. And then also to UMA Books, who is our bookseller for tonight, back there. That's Mag. And then, of course, to our guests here, Rebecca Carroll, Lisa Nopachai, Matthew Celestis, Eric Smith, and our moderator, Lily Philpott. And with that, I will hand it over to Lily.
Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you all so much for being here, for all of our writers and our audience. Before we get started, because I've overheard a couple of conversations about this already, I wanted to ask if everyone who is comfortable doing so would raise their hands if they are an adoptee in the room.
Love to see it.
It's beautiful. It's usually like a tentative, maybe one hand, maybe two, but so beautiful. We're so grateful you're here. We are going to do some reading, some conversation, but I wanted to get us started with a kind of round robin question. We're not going to do your more formal bios, but I do want to go down the line and ask you to just talk a little bit about how you identify yourselves, specifically how you identify yourselves as an adoptee. As an example, I always say I'm a transracial, transnational adoptee. Finding that language was really liberating for me, and so would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Hi, I'm Lisa Nopachai, and I identify as a Mexican-American adoptee who's raised in an Italian-American family. And I also would identify as someone who's in a reunion. I've known my birth mom for over half my life now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Eric Smith. I'm a Honduran Palestinian adoptee and raised by an Irish Catholic family outside of Newark, New Jersey, not too far from here. And yeah, I guess I'm also, what was the term you used?
In reunion.
In reunion. Yeah, I met my birth family about 4 years ago, and yeah, big part of my life now too.
Yes, we all have our own mics too, but we just keep asking around. I'm Matthew Celestis. I am also a transracial, transnational adoptee, and adoptee. Yeah, that's good.
Y'all are so neat and tidy. I identify as a Black woman who was adopted into a white family and raised in an all-white rural town.
Thank you all so much, and again for being here. We're going to get started with Eric reading a little bit, an excerpt from his short story included in this anthology, When We Become Ours, again for sale with the beautiful and wonderful mag from UMA Books at the back of the room. Then we'll get into questions. So please take it away.
Sounds good. Feeling very 40 right now. There we go. So yeah, my story in here is called Truffles, parenthesis, or Don't Worry, the Dog Will Be Fine. I'm in the barn again. Why do we even have a barn? Thick stalks of hay dig into my thighs from the... Oh!
Knock your mic a little bit closer. Don't move it around. Sorry. Who's bossy? Not me.
What happens in public radio?
Thick stalks of hay dig into my thighs from the bale I'm sitting on, pinching at my skin no matter how much I shift my weight. My jeans might be thick, but my skin has never been. I know that much about myself. Heart on my sleeve and all that. I'm living my life as though I'm an emo song mistakenly dropped on a country music playlist. I close my eyes, inhaling and exhaling, the simultaneously sweet and stale and wet smell of the farm enveloping me. The straw, the earth, the autumn leaves, and the lingering scent of burning of those things burning in the distance. The smell is comforting, even as I'm wildly aware of the fact that I don't fit in here, just about as well as this barn does. My parents farm blueberries. Yet we've got this barn with stables and hay, as if horses are gonna one day sprout up out of the soil. Uncle Morris has a barn on his property, and Dad just had to have one of his own. At least that's the story Mom tells anyone when people come by to clean the thing. It mostly sits empty. Why is there even hay in here? I grip the bale of hay, hot tears streaming down my face. It's all just playing pretend. The barn, the stables with no horses, the hay that no one's gonna eat save for the mice that probably live in it. None of it fits, but it feels like it's supposed to. Like I'm supposed to. Like everyone wants me to, while simultaneously pointing me out, the adopted brown kid with a white country family. I couldn't be a needle in a haystack if I tried here. I'm like a pitchfork someone tossed in there, obvious, different, and jutting upwards. The hay jabs into my palms, and I let go, shaking my hands as I grip my teeth and exhale. This Thanksgiving was supposed to be different. The last one before I leave for college next year, before I'm across the country in Oregon, in a place where traveling back to South Jersey for the holidays is a costly impossibility. No more awkward, quick looks from cousins as they grow old enough to understand, or whispered chatter among aunts and uncles who are old enough to know better. No more outspoken questions about the color the eyes of every new friend or boyfriend or girlfriend who arrives on the scene, just quick enough to disappoint me and leave their name forgotten at the next get together. Doesn't matter how fresh the damn cranberries are around here, I'm not coming back. And I sure as hell have no plans to spend another Christmas or Easter or St. Patrick's Day at Aunt Melinda's cranberry bog a few miles down the road. It's a farm, she insists. It's a red fucking swamp, Melinda. I just wanted a good Thanksgiving. Just one. He's in here. Startled, I lean back, almost falling off the hay bale. Dad squeezes his way through the narrow opening in the heavy barn doors, prying them open just a bit for Mom. The two of them look panicked, and nothing like me. Dad has the gait and muscle of Bruce Willis in his early movies, complete with the shiny bald head. Though Mom is definitely not someone who needs saving. Tall and lean and strong, a retired ballerina who now teaches Pilates to bored husbands and wives in the farming community, she probably could have kicked the door open herself. Dylan, Jesus, Dad says, walking towards me, sounding a little out of breath. You can't just take off, and you said there wasn't going to be anyone new this year. I stand up, crossing my arms, trying to hold back all the emotions brewing up. It's bad enough I have to deal with this when we travel for holidays, visiting aunts and uncles and homes in bigger cities with streetlights and fireflies. This is our home. Stop right there.
Thank
Okay.
you. That's beautiful. As is so true with every story in this collection, the stories that you all have written outside of this collection, there's just so much that I relate to. I don't have the precise background, but as a transracial adoptee, there's just so much that rings a bell and is so beautiful. And I wanted to actually start with you because I know we're just past the Thanksgiving holiday. I wanted to kind of thank and mention that Katie sent me a really lovely email acknowledging that the holidays, family-based holidays, can be really difficult for adoptees. Around a big table full of people who don't look like you, it can be tough. So I wanted to start here and I have a question for you, but then also want to open it up and get reactions from the other readers, writers, any thoughts. So my question is really about craft. I really love your character's voice in this story. It goes on, but I feel like we got a pretty good sense of what their voice is like in the excerpt you just read. It feels so real. And I want to ask if you can speak to how you developed that voice in this particular story, but also how you found your own voice as a writer and as an adoptee writer, if you separate those in your mind.
Yes, oh my goodness, thank you so much. That's so nice. So I guess on a craft level, when it comes to writing young adult short stories and young adult books, I've been writing YA for a while, and I just, in order to try to stay in touch with that like teenage side of myself, because I'm no longer that age, I try to read a YA novel every week. I try to consume TV shows that are written actually for the teenagers. Like there's a difference, like Riverdale has teenagers, but it's not for teenagers, you know? So I try to make sure I'm staying as in touch as I can. But then like as someone writing adoptee stories, I cheat a little and I pull from my life. You know, a lot of the characters that are adoptees in the novels and the stories I write, they come from me, you know, and those Thanksgiving holidays and Christmas and all of that stuff, like that's almost always explored in all of my stories because they're the worst. There's always that one new family member or significant other that's like looking at you from across the room, like, but there's a story here, and maybe it's not their business. So yeah, that's where that comes from for sure.
Just as sort of context for the rest of the audience here, do you want to talk a little bit about what the kind of inciting incident is in your story, that significant other who does say something? And
yeah, absolutely. So so in Truffles, I guess the slight spoiler of the story is that it's about an adoptee who finds a dog on the farm, a puppy, and decides to try to raise it to fit in with these truffle hunting pigs on the farm. Because I don't know about all of you, but like growing up, I read so many stories about adopted kids, but told to me through the perspective of like, look at this goose that adopted this duck. And I'm like, cool, great, but I'm a person. So I wanted to show it going poorly and what that experience would feel like for the kid. And the inciting incident that happens in here that gets her upset is there's a new relative, a relative has a new significant other who like refers to her as like the help, and that it's nice they let the help come on and come off the farm and join in the festivities, and it's not great.
it's really very painful. And I mean, the way it ends in this story, it just feels is really beautiful. So please do read the rest of that. To the rest of our panelists, any thoughts on the holiday season as we pass through and start to approach into it? And then we'll do some more reading.
Oh, there it is.
Hello?
Oh, okay.
Uh-oh.
Or maybe switch.
That one off there.
They keep asking me. I think about the holidays, and I'm a great deal older than all y'all on here. I think about the holidays very much in the tradition of something that Black folks have done throughout history, which is create their own portrait galleries in their homes because we couldn't see our images anywhere else. So I do that. And then I also have chosen family that populate my holidays now, which doesn't address what happens to the adoptive family and the adoptive relationships. And I'm really curious to hear from you all, and also you all, you know, I heard you say you're in Reunion. I was in Reunion. I don't know how many of you have read my memoir, but was in Reunion for many years, and it's a very complicated story, as they all are. But part of what drew me to this project and writing forward and speaking to younger adoptees, transracial adoptees, is to give them the wings, sort of, to fly into whatever their lives are going to mean and be a coalescence of what we've experienced and what the next generation can experience.
Any thoughts, or we can also sort of let that percolate and come back to it too. Matthew, I'd love to ask you to read our next excerpt from your story, which is titled White People.
It's something to say, yeah. Strong point. I'm going to read from like a little bit farther into the story, but I think what you need to know is the narrator's family has moved from Hartford to this rural town, and the father loses his job soon after that. And in order to like stay in the town in her dream house, the mother starts a chicken farm. And the narrator, who's 10, I think, is very excited about this since now she has all these chickens to play with. When the chickens were 14 weeks old, though, 8 fell over dead in the night. The next night, 12 more. My mother was frantic. Each chick was an investment not only of money, but of energy, care, hope. My father, by that time was coming around, called the veterinarian. The vet knew all about us, small town gossip. He knew about the chicken farm and that my father had lost his job. My mother gestured for my father to put the call on speaker. Will you even be able to afford the fees? The vet asked. Do you have insurance? Will you sell the land once the farm fails? It's not going to fail, my father said. You're lowering its value, you know. It's not going to fail, my father said again, raising his voice. I was surprised. It was the first time I'd ever heard him defend the farm like that. Before, he had acted like it didn't matter if it failed. Like, what was the difference? He stared at the phone as if glaring into someone's eyes. It was anger, I realized, which gave him that belief in us, that confidence. Though he seemed to be angrier about this gossip about the farm than about losing his job. I couldn't get my child's brain around this puzzle. It didn't make sense to me. It was a question I would often ask myself afterward. Why criticizing the farm made him angrier, especially since at first he didn't care for it. As if, as soon as the vet said we could not succeed, my father made up his mind to do so for the first time. I heard Vaughn Farm is pretty pissed off, the vet said. You're taking their business. My mother covered her mouth. Vaughn was the one big farm nearby and the source of most local produce. At the supermarket, all you could get were national brands and Vaughn. Their farm was 2 towns over and took up a lot of land, a proper dairy outfit. But it had been around long enough that it used older, crueler practices. That was how we planned to distinguish ourselves. We had actually driven over there to check them out, and the only livestock outside were cows. The chickens were all locked away in a long green metal coop that looked like an army barracks. Vaughn's my biggest client, the vet said. I wouldn't want to ruin that relationship. Of course you wouldn't, my father said, and we wouldn't tell anyone. The vet laughed once and hung up. It's up there too. This is like it's a Korean family in a very white town, so
Thank you so much. I have a question for you, but before I wanted to just sort of note that there's this theme in your work that I'm just remembering now of a family living in a rural community, a rural place with a transracial adopted child, which is my own story, and I think many of our stories as well. And just something interesting there that like the freedom you experience, I know I felt the first time I moved to New York City, and there are people who looked like not only me, but my little brother as well for the first time. But just sort of putting a pin in that to return to. So Matthew, I'd love to talk to you about the story deals very much with this idea of otherness. It considers the idea of a model minority and the ways that we as adoptees have to deal with stereotypes without growing up within a cultural context that builds that stereotype. So I'd love to hear, how does your work deal with the idea of the other, and creatively and personally, what can we gain by naming it or not?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So in this story, the other is white people, right? That's the title. And it's something that the kids, so there's just these 2 Asian girls in this entire school. And so they become kind of friends by proxy. They're forced into this relationship where people start to mistake them for each other. But they're also kind of the only people who understand each other in a way. So they become like friends plus rivals. And when they talk about white people, they have to kind of like lower their voice and say white people because people don't like to be called white, which is weird, but that's okay. And so the other here is a kind of scary thing looming out there that for them is the dominant power. Right? And so once the chickens start to die on the farm, there's nobody knows why it's happening. I mean, there's no sign of sickness per se. The vet won't come, but they don't know enough about chickens to know whether the chickens are sick or not. And they don't know which chickens are sick enough to bring them into a vet, since they have to now go to a vet. And so the father decides that he's going to take a gun and stay up all night outside with the chickens And for the first time, the girl realizes that something else might be going on, right? Because why does the father need a gun? Why does he need to stay up at night with the chickens? And the first night the father does this, none of the chickens die. And so in a way, it's like a monster story, and the monster is white people.
And I think, I mean, the subtlety with that, the way we receive the information through your younger character's eyes, and then we as adult readers can kind of put the pieces together as we think through and proceed through the rest of the story. I know you also teach creative writing. You have an incredible book about craft that I'm sure everyone is aware of, called Craft in the Real World. Really, really excellent. How might you sort of transfer that to classes that you might teach to writers who are or not adopted? That sort of like that balance of writing for adults, but writing a child's perspective, and the subtlety. There's just so much happening in that simple scene, that simple idea.
Yeah, I was asked to contribute a story, and I didn't really have one. Written stories in a while. I've just become much more interested in the longer form. And so I have this, I've been working, this is an excerpt from a novel that I'm working on. But it's a novel for adults, and the character is, I think, younger than what a typical YA character would be. And so I felt like I was sending something that should not be in the anthology, but I guess I just decided to put it in anyway. I think though that you're right. Like for me, any narrator, you have to be able to see around them. Right? They have the perspective, and you are looking through their eyes, kind of at the scene. But no narrator kind of has the full story, and they're always telling their own story, right? Whatever they're looking at their own thing. Right? Whatever they're saying their own thing. Whatever they're hearing, then it's like in a way, right? They're hearing what is important to them. And so a big challenge for my students is usually like how to understand the rest of the world and how the rest of the world sees the narrator. And it's hard because as soon as you kind of introduce a first person narrator, you introduce some doubt about how much of what they're saying is true, right? And everybody has, I'm always telling my students, right, every character lives in their own world. And so that each character has a world. And even though they're living in the same world, this narrator's world is very different from her bully's world. And in order to kind of see around them, I mean, I think there are ways in which you can kind of have characters notice things that are going around without understanding them. That's one way. People can also tend to like say too much around kids. I know I always say too much around my kids. I know in the back of my head that they're listening, but like it's hard to forget. It's easy to forget that they're listening. And then a child will like kind of run with that in a way that can become its own story, and then also kind of speaks to the larger story as well.
I love that idea of being able to see around the narrator and having to see around the narrator in the world and worlds that all of the characters inhabit. I want to see, I would kind of open it up to all of you if there are comments, thoughts on that, on writing for this anthology or outside of it.
So one thing that I think is like particularly special about writing about the adoptee experience for kids and for young adults is that when you look at like the coming of age narrative, right? So much of it is trying to figure out who I am, trying to figure out what the world is like, trying to figure out who I am in this world now that I figured it out, right? That's like the coming of age arc. But when you're an adoptee, that trying to figure out who I am first step is sometimes really hard to unravel, sometimes impossible, and you end up in this like state of like arrested developments, that can be really hard to figure out. So like I love exploring that in kid lit, because how do you write a story that's supposed to have that full arc when you can't get past that first one? And it's, I don't know, that's the thing that drives me to it.
It's also, I mean, as you're saying that, it's the template of our lives.
Yeah.
it doesn't stop after YA ends, you know, where do I enter? How do I fit in here? How do I reconcile the universal truth of it? That's the irony, right, of the adoptees experience, is that we are the template for what everybody's going through, except it's far more acute for us. So it would make sense for folks to listen to us more.
It's also making me think, in the adoptee studies field, there's this term coming out of the fog, which I will do my best to describe, which is essentially the idea that non-adopted folks have sort of like a coming of age moment. They reach a certain age, they enter college, and then they kind of move past that, and adoptees come out of the fog around their early to mid 20s, and we have a second sort of coming of age experience in which maybe a reunion happens, maybe you finally are at a place where it's like, I'm gonna face this head on. It's a very difficult thing to consider as a child. I know I felt as a kid, it was like I lied a lot and didn't want to tell people that I was adopted because it was like, it's complicated, I don't want to talk about it. But that is always an interesting topic to me, and really interesting while thinking about YA Lit as well. If like there is some studies, I believe, that like the ages are different for adoptees. We are constantly doing this. I'd love to turn to.
Just to respond to that question. I think with YA, I think about brain development and just these higher order levels of thinking that are just starting to develop over the course of the teenage years and everything. And it's just like, wow, it's just so much more complex for adoptees. All these, a lot of my stories about awkwardness and feeling like a lack of belonging, and every teenager goes through that, but how much more so for adoptees?
I'm actually going to hand this right back to you because I'd love for you to read from Glide.
All right, I'm going to read a few little parts of it. So the main character is Emma, and she's invited to a college diversity open house as a prospective student. I wasn't even sure how the school got my info, maybe through standardized testing. The few times I had to fill out a race ethnicity section on something, I never felt sure of what to put. Ever since I was little, my parents were super open about the fact that my younger sister and I were both adopted at birth, and that we were Mexican American. People always said we looked alike with our tan skin, thick wavy black hair, and big brown eyes. I thought it was kind of funny since we weren't actually blood related, but I guess as some of the only kids in town who looked like that, we stood out. During the standardized tests we had to take in school, I would move my cursor across the screen and slowly, with uncertainty, click on the Hispanic Latino box. I would still feel somewhat fraudulent as I scrolled down to the next question. So I guess that's how a Sweden college got my info. So then she goes to college, and her roommate invites her to New York City. She's just driving down to the city, and Emma has a day to herself to explore. It was the music that drew me in. I heard the bass pulsing in the distance, which was nothing new for a city that never sleeps. But it was the trumpet crescendos, the shakers, and the overlapping percussion beats, the complexity of chords, or at least chord changes I wasn't used to in the top 40 pop or hip hop I listened to. The strings in the background, the fun staccato piano riffs, the Spanish I didn't understand much of, sounding beautiful, the feeling that this music ran in my blood. I didn't know my blood very well, not nearly as well as most other people knew their roots probably, but I knew how to explore. That's what I've been doing all day. The salsa music drew me in. So she goes into the nightclub, she takes a salsa lesson. The teachers encouraged us to introduce ourselves to the person who was standing in front of us. Soy Alejandro, my partner said. He was probably a little older than me, a tall guy with kind eyes and a form-fitting collared shirt. ¿Vienes aquí a menudo? He asked. Oh, I guess I look like I speak Spanish. I've gotten this before, and I've always frozen because despite trying to learn some of the language in school, I've been terrible at actually using it in real life. To me, it's always been a classroom thing, like biology or algebra. If you put me behind a desk with a test on what he just said, I'd be good. I would have prepared and studied. I probably would have gotten an A or a B+ for sure. but I had no idea what he just said to me. And now I felt super awkward because I've been staring at him for a few seconds with what I'm sure was a strange and panicked look on my face. No, hablo mucho español, I said awkwardly, with none of the inflection of a native speaker, because, well, I wasn't a native speaker. Trying to add that felt strange to me, even though this language was probably somewhere in my blood. A language I had learned as the only Latina besides the teacher in classrooms filled with white, non-Latino students. So this was an uncomfortable moment.
Thank you. I'm so glad you read that portion because I want to ask you a little bit about that specific scene where your character goes salsa dancing and finds so much liberation and joy in that. And then your reading as well has sparked a couple of other things I want to pose to the rest of the couch. But you write so beautifully in this story about the joy in taking part in something your DNA or your blood, as you said, recognizes instinctively after a lifetime of being the odd one out. And I think this is such a valuable lesson to young adoptees that there is community out there. Even though, as we saw with Alejandro, maybe it will take some explaining to kind of integrate, there is community. So I wanted to hear you talk about why the genre of YA is so vital, what drew you to this genre, and to working with young people in particular, because I know that it's also part of your day job.
Yeah, so I got into YA Lit because my niece, when she was entering high school, she was going through some hard times, and we just ended up connecting every month over the phone. And so she would tell me about what she was reading, and then I would read it, and we talk about it, and I got really into it. And yeah, I feel like it's just so, just the experience of learning salsa for me, like this is basically like my story, right? Like I learned salsa, and just the nonverbal piece of it was just so powerful to me. Because, you know, so much of trauma is nonverbal, and so much of the awkwardness is like sharing our stories verbally. And so to be able to connect with the Latino community through completely no words at all was just so liberating to me. But what I wanted to mention in response to that question that I was considering before coming here was that, so I just, I have been involved in a lot of things where people break out into ethnic specific groups. And especially when I was younger, like this story talks a lot about just feeling fraudulent, right? And I, you know, whenever I was in one of these places where you split out into ethnic specific groups, I would always go to multi-ethnic because I thought, well, you know, I'm Mexican American, but like I'm adopted into Italian family. So I would go to multi-ethnic. So I was on my way to a multi-ethnic room one time and I passed all the other rooms, and the Latina room was like, it was a women of color event, and the Latina room was right before multi-ethnic, and the woman just said, "Oh, come on in." She just looked at me, and I was like, "Oh, okay, I guess I will." So I did, and I sat down. We're all introducing ourselves in the circle, and every single person who shared before me was talking about how they felt not enough. Like, you know, they weren't Colombian enough, or they weren't Peruvian enough, or they weren't this or that, and just struggling with that. And so I felt comfortable enough to share about my own experience and how, you know, I was an adoptee and I'd never been in the, like, I'd never gone to the Latina room before. And after I finished sharing, the woman right across from me in this big circle of women looked me straight in the eye, and she said, "Welcome." And that's what I hope this book achieves for all the young adults out there, is just, you know, welcome, like you belong here.
The acknowledgement, I believe, on the very first page of this anthology from Shannon, Gibney, and Nicole Chung dedicates this to all the young adoptees out there, and it just says, "We got you." And I feel like that is really the spirit of welcome, is what they are trying to do in the book, which is so beautiful. I wanted to kind of pose a question to the rest of the writers up here as well about this word fraudulent. Feeling like a fraud is a very familiar one in my own experience, and I think perhaps it may be for the rest of you. Fraudulence in terms of like tradition, culture, but also language. I was also adopted from a Spanish-speaking country, from Chile, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to reclaim that native language. And it is such a joy when it comes out of my mouth, and sometimes it really is a struggle and exhausting. But I'd love to kind of get everyone's thoughts on just this idea of being a fraud, looking for welcome. Where have you found that? And what has that been like in your writing careers, but also in your just personally?
I think one of the greatest detriments of transracial adoption is this this kind of extrication from community, and certainly culture and history and ancestry and all the rest, but from community. There is this isolation that happens that turns you into an individual fighting for your livelihood, which runs entirely counter to community. And so, of course, when you meet or come into contact with the community and the culture from which you're from, you're going to feel defensive, fraudulent, and like you have to continue to fight for your livelihood as an individual. I mean, I think that's one thing that we don't talk about enough, just the way in which it runs counter to the notion of community, which is what fosters your sense of self.
Yeah, I mean, I felt that fraudulent thing my whole life because like my name's Eric Smith, like it's the latest name imaginable. And it's really hard to like
Rebecca Carroll.
yeah,
Lily
explain,
Philpott.
yeah, like that I'm like also a person of color. Hello with everybody, you know. I think the thing that made me feel a little less fraudulent growing up was I was very fortunate to have like a great group of friends, right? And I remember, you know, you get bullied when you're a teenager by people who don't quite understand what is going on with you. And I had some not great kids in my life, but then I had some friends who, when I was feeling not quite enough as like a person of color and not dealing with hard things in my family, they plotted a salsa dancing lesson thing for me. So yeah, all my Hispanic friends, they all got together and
That's
now I'm
squad.
very good. Yeah. No, they're still all my best friends like 25 years later. But yeah, like having a good community of pals that like, oh no, you're one of us. Come on.
Yeah.
We're gonna show you was very helpful because I love my family, but they were just like, oh, we don't see color. That doesn't help. Wow.
I think in the age, the era in which I was adopted, that was sort of a teaching for adopted parents, because I heard that many times, and I don't know if I understand still why that is not productive in any way.
Seems like maybe just a cultural teaching. Yeah, I mean, that sounds great. I wish I had some community in, but I grew up like my narrator kind of, but without really anybody I could talk to. And it wasn't until, I mean, even though ended up finding community later as an adult, I think it was just having my own family that changed things, right? Just you have your own people, right? And they're your people, right? And you just, for me, I hadn't been in a reunion or really ever met anybody from my birth family, so it was the first time I had a birth family. Yeah, so that's how I found that sense of identity, I guess.
I think that's a really perfect segue to Rebecca's reading, actually. It's been really beautiful.
Thanks for
Thank
setting
you.
me up. Hey, who's got the good mic? Okay. The forward is kind of short, so I read the whole thing or? I use the term mind-blowing every time I try to describe what it felt like to give birth to my son 17 years ago. Family I made of my body. A brown boy who later, when he was about 4 years old, would see his own reflection in a photo of me as a child. As a Black girl adopted by a white family raised in an all-white New England town, I could not have possibly imagined how to prepare for having this child who would look so much like me, a child who would one day grow up and strike out on his own. Even when I saw a Black person in real life for the first time at 6 years old, or felt something indescribable that I didn't have the language to make sense of, or wondered whether Easy Reader on PBS children's program Electric Company might be my birth father. These were seemingly abstract instances that transported me to a kind of paradoxical Netherland, where Black people were simultaneously both familiar and foreign. Nothing in my adoptee experience prepared me for what it would feel like to grow a person inside my body, who would be born with my DNA and also look like me. Next year, it's actually this year, my son will be off to college. I'd like to think that had there been more representation of transracial adoptees in books, movies, TV, and songs, anywhere really, I might have been better prepared for the prospect of my child becoming a whole individual independent of me, and of course his father, that the prospect of him possibly attending college far from home would feel less like a specter of my central adoption trauma, and perhaps more like a thrilling sense of gratitude for my son's independence. I may still get there yet. That is what the stories in When We Become Ours do for transracial adoptees, and oh, that they would have been available to me growing up. I wish I had known as a girl, then as a young woman, then that the shared grief of transracial adoptees is complex, but not insurmountable. And as the stories here demonstrate so beautifully, that we are more than and can move beyond our adoption experiences. Our imaginations, especially our young ones, are brimming with ideas, bursting with creative energy, and transforming trauma into new and nuanced narratives. Representation makes us feel less alone. Representation plus imagination anoints us to fly. Read these stories and soar.
Thank you so much. I love that forward. I don't even want to call it a forward. It feels like an essay or prayer, kind of invocation for the rest of the book. And yeah, it's just beautiful. So I wanted to ask you, I love that you wrote about motherhood and becoming a mother as an adoptee, that beauty of seeing your son see himself in you and photographs of you when you were younger. And I want to ask a sort of similar question to what I asked Lisa about why YA, why this genre. This particularly when thinking about motherhood, family, healing, you know, what can this genre provide? Can this anthology in particular, but beyond as well, provide that you may not have experienced, that all of us may not have experienced as children?
I think what's really interesting, and also touching on what Matt had said about writing something that he wasn't sure it should be in a YA anthology, is, and I say this as a mother of a teenager and now freshman in college, is that YA, or the idea of young adult, is evolving. It's evolving as we're living it. It's evolving in real time. And I think it's all well and good and actually quite necessary for us to imbue our ideas, our imaginations into these stories for YA. But what the young adults do when they read it is they take it and do what they want with it. And that, I think, is so critically important, and to also encourage that sort of feverish creativity and imagination. And we're not saying this is how it has to be. We're saying this is how it could be, or this is one way of it being. And so when I think of YA, I just think of endless possibilities, and that we have the experience and the wisdom to put into this bucket, and then the young folks who read it can do what they will.
I love that. I want to open it up to audience Q&A in a moment. So if you have questions, please start thinking of them now. But before we do, a couple of more questions for our panelists here. I have another round robin question to sort of close us off, but I'm also wondering if anyone has questions for anyone else on the stage after having heard each other read, questions, thoughts, if any of the conversation sparked anything, and if you want to ask your fellow panelists questions.
A messy question. So I'm curious, Does anyone in your family read your work about being an adoptee? I think mine doesn't, is a quick answer. I think my parents don't, but yeah, I'm curious.
Well, this is my first work as an adoptee. But you know, I really value just like the integrity of being honest, and that's something like, I don't know, I've had conversations with my parents that other families would have disbanded, and what I would have been disowned if it was another family. And I'm grateful that my parents have been open to those conversations. So I did share it with my mom. But you know, safety first, right?
My dad just started reading my books, and has been reading them in order. I don't know really what to think about. For a long time, they would just tell me to not write about them anymore. So it must have been some kind of sea change that happened. I think just speaks to this, like everybody's kind of going through their own thing, right? And I know my parents are kind of going through their own things too. It doesn't necessarily make it easier to empathize with them, but I mean, I do think that all the time about my students too, and about, right, like about people in your lives. I just wanted to say too about the fraudulent question. I think like one of the things from your forward, Rebecca, was like having a kid in a way like made me feel real, right? And the stories, I mean, I think they kind of offer that like sense that your world is a real world. Yeah, and that would have been, I think, for me too. And I think there's a sense that it's not even fraudulent, but like where you don't even know that your reality is reality.
And I think to sort of build off of that, and also something that you had said earlier about crafting characters who are living in their own worlds, you know, and that is definitely a part of writing fiction. But the relationship between fiction and nonfiction is like this close, right? Because in fact, we're all living in our own worlds. And so, you know, even for myself, writing a memoir, my memory, my experience is my experience. And so you all can interface with it the way that you want to, still my experience. And so insofar as family reading the work, for me, it's been a really, really tough experience. You know, I wrote what I waited my lifetime to write, and I poured everything into it. And in many ways, I felt like it was a gift to my white family. Like, wouldn't you want to know what my experience was? But they all took great offense, and it's been a really, really difficult. But the just to point out that the relationship between fiction and nonfiction, and I thought about that a lot as I was writing the forward for this, is like it's very, very, very close, and which in fact I think bolsters the reality of these worlds that certainly that you all have created in this book, and also the myriad ways in which adoptees, transracial adoptees specifically, can navigate the world.
This is making me think of one other question, just in terms of genre. We're talking about YA genre, you all write in fiction, nonfiction, all of that. I feel like the adoptee experience lends itself so well to so many genres. There are metaphors that can be science fiction. Exactly, science fiction, fantasy, just everything. It feels like you could pull into it. Are there other genres you're interested in exploring, or you feel like are really ripe for adoptee stories?
I think TV is dying for it. Like there's nothing out there. I mean, we need a great sort of limited series or ongoing series. I'm working on one, but it's a crazy Hollywood's banana pants. Yeah, so definitely TV.
I'd love to write a sci-fi novel. Like, I think that would be a lot of fun. But oh God, I would love to write a modern video game about the adoptee experience. So like I grew up playing like Final Fantasy and Chrono Trigger and all those RPGs, and every single one of them, it's like here's the orphan child who finds the soul and goes on the adventure. And I would love to be able to make it feel more real, you know, instead of like having the adoptee story be like a little quirk to get the story started, have it be something significant. That'd be fun. Square Enix, if you're listening, let's
I'm not really thinking about other genres, but I do think that's true, that it's true that like people use adoption, right, all the time as a kind of like.
Steven Spielberg's whole.
Mhm. And it makes sense, I guess, if you're thinking like, it takes away some kind of knowledge of a past, like an orphan or an adoptee. And then the great thing about an adoptee is then that past can come in later on as a revelation. So it's like, it's something that gives you something on a craft level. But yeah, it's so often just something that gives you something on a craft level. That's really not the answer to the question. Personal grace.
Such a good point, because I think it's often treated in Hollywood on TV as like a really convenient plot point because there is drama baked into it, and it's never written by adoptees. It's never true to adoptee experience.
It's literally Steven Spielberg's whole oof.
Yeah, I heard you say that at
Yeah.
the end of the couch. I was going to ask you to repeat it.
I've thought about dabbling in children's literature, like the younger kids. I love there's this book called The Rabbit Listened, and these books that are social emotional learning where it's like it's really for the parent who's reading it, and I was like in tears by the end, and my kids like but yeah, I think there's so much ripeness for like these two different levels of writing.
It's so funny that you mentioned that, because when my child was very small, we read it to him every night, and there were so few books about, well, any adoption certainly, but also just about Black children. But there was this one series called Llama Llama Red Pajama, and this mother was enraged that her child needed his mama. I remember reading this one time and saying, what is going on? Why is she stopping everything and going to her child's aid, right? Like, I mean, it was like, but it was such an adoptive reaction. It was like, he feels abandoned. He's in his bed and he just wants to know that she's there.
I think we're going to open it up to audience Q&A, but the round robin question that I mentioned earlier is for all of you. We can go down the line. Maybe we'll do it opposite, starting at Rebecca. And I want to actually build off of a phrase you used in your foreword, which is this idea of transforming trauma into joy. And I just want to, this is a big question, I realize, but I want to ask how in your lives, in your writing, you all have learned how to do that, to transform trauma into joy. What are moments of adoptee joy that you can share that our audience can take with them as they go?
That is a big question. I think, and I'm glad you asked it, because I don't have a lot of touch points of adoption joy. But if not for adoption, or had I not been an adoptee, I would not feel the absolute mind-blowing experience of being a mother to my child.
Yeah, I guess I'll second that, but also like finding other adoptees. I think at certain points in my life, that's been really important to me.
Adoptee joy is kind of hard. That's
Yeah.
a hard one. I feel like it came for me much later. But like, like my family is not we don't talk about our feelings in the family I was raised in, right? It's very like white Irish Catholic conservative. You just bury those feelings deep inside and never let them out. And I remember this one Christmas, like my uncle out of nowhere, he comes up to me, he's like, Eric, we're all really proud of you and the stuff that you've done. It must be hard, being the adopted one and all. And like,
Did he say and all?
yeah,
That's
yeah.
such where you grew up. That's such a way.
Oh no, I grew up in outside Newark.
Okay.
Yeah. And like I remember him saying that, and it was like the first like ever recognition of the fact that I was like the adopted kid. And like for him to say that, like was not said in a sensitive way at all. There was no hug, anything like that. I'm pretty sure he went off to get a beer, but like that meant so much. Like, and I've brought it up many times over the years, and he's like, all right.
Yeah.
We've done the feelings thing, so that's some cute moment of joy.
For me, two things. The first is finding the adoptee community. I had a therapist who's an adoptee who encouraged me to do it when I was like totally scared to even Google the word because I was afraid of what it might bring up. But having that therapist is amazing. The second thing is just giving birth to my own child, which came with a whole bunch of other crazy things that were terrible in terms of like the adoptee processing, but having, like I said, I have a good relationship with my adoptive mom, and she was there and cut the cord of my second child. And that was just so powerful to me that she couldn't be there when I was actually born, but she could be there for that.
Thank you all so much. I love that. Audience questions. Yeah, do you want to stand up and project, or you can run and I'll give you the mic?
I understand. I would write it up. Articulate it properly. How has your relationship with Homeland, or maybe no Homeland involved, as you've aged, been able to surround yourself with people who look like you, like have you become more or less forgiving of the environment you were raised in? Or if you felt like any sort of conflict or animosity, like if you felt that animosity in the first place, or fine, have you become more or less forgiving?
Did everyone hear that? Is that?
Can you just rephrase, summarize?
Yeah, let me try and rephrase, and if I get it wrong, will you raise your hand and I will try it. I think the question was visiting Homeland and considering Homeland. How has that made you more forgiving to the
Homeland is in like where, like not necessarily Homeland, like like where we're adopted from, but like literally the idea of where we're raised, because it's not really our homeland. We're removed from what. So like no, yeah.
And so the question of the homeland in terms of where we're raised and our sort of journeys of forgiveness towards that place as we have come into ourselves, is that?
I've had a very big evolution in my relationship when I was young, because I don't know, my early 20s.
For sure. Thank you.
I've become both less forgiving, but also less upset. Like, I don't feel much animosity, but I also feel very little forgiveness as well.
Yeah, that resonates. That, the thing about growing up in this beautiful bucolic New Hampshire town is that, I always knew that I would leave, but I never imagined I wouldn't be welcomed back. And so that has made me feel like, I don't feel super angry, but I don't feel a ton of forgiveness either.
It's just such an interesting question because like I feel like my view on it changed a lot when I did meet my birth family. Because I had this, I'm really curious what your experience was too, but I had this like image in my head that like, maybe they were like very brown, just like me. Maybe they were very invested in their culture. And like when I met my birth mom, she had like the thickest Jersey accent you've ever heard. And it kind of ripped the door off the hinges there in terms of like what my image was. But like when I started like connecting with them, like, my adopted family, again, like not big on feelings, not big on discussion. Like my birth family is like very like granola and crystals and like everyone hugs and like my siblings fall asleep on the couch in piles together. And it was a very like interesting like nature versus nurture discovery for me. So like, I don't know, like I look at the way I was raised and I see the things that I got out of that and the way that, what's in my genes and what I've gotten out of that. And I end up feeling kind of grateful, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the nature versus nurture thing because there are dancers in my biological family, which is awesome to discover. But yeah, I think in terms of becoming more forgiving, what comes to mind is just the healing and the hours upon hours of therapy and just the anger of like, why do I have to do this more than other people, right? But like, yeah, just the healing to be able to return with eyes wide open and say like, okay, this is how it really is. And I can do that now.
It all resonates so much. Thank you all. Another question? Yeah, in the back on the right.
Hi, thanks all for coming. So I think it's really powerful to see the adoptees connect, community come together. I was wondering how being invited to this project, what you gained from it in your own personal life, and how you sort of see how broaden maybe your imagination or your hopes to the adoptee community and creative community moving forward. So I think it was really powerful to me is I think a lot of times you grow up as adoptees with this idea that our experience is isolated and that is, I mean, all our experiences are of course unique, but I think there's this idea that we're the only adoptee and one of the men where we feel very alone in experience, and anytime I've come together with adoptee community, I've always felt very just, it's been a very powerful place, and adoptees are very great at we're organizers, we're creatives, we're all these things. And so I think it's really powerful to have adoptees come together and have an anthology. And I wonder how being a part of this process has what it's brought to you, what you think moving forward.
I would say that again, as someone who's a great deal older than everyone on this panel, you know, I have been kicking this down the road for decades. Like the idea that we are extraordinarily creative, that our ideas and our skills and our talents are about multi-doing, multi-emotional, that we have insight into the relationship, into the colonization of this nation that the democracy is founded on, that our insights are so critically important, and that we should be listened to across genres, across industry, and that we can then move that forward so that it isn't just adoptee only, but it is that, wow, you have this expertise and this wisdom because of your experience, which is so much about America. It is so fundamentally about America in terms of who gets to decide what the standard of beauty is, what the canon of literature is, what values are. I mean, so all of those things we have lived in real time, grown in real time, tried to extricate ourselves from in real time while also surviving and thriving. And so I think what is so really, I guess, a joyful adoptee moment is just to think that this book is out there, that somebody believed in this book as being something that's needed. And I think that it's precedent. I think that there will be more to come.
I mean, what you read is just, oh, I'm sorry. Reading is just so powerful. The only thing I ever read as a teenager about adoption was a Chicken Soup for the Soul story where the adoptive mom and the birth mom met and got along so well. And like, just when it didn't turn out that way, I was like, oh, you know, just any kind of representation. And when I found out the adoptee suicide rate is 4 times the national rate, I was like, if there's any little tiny drop of a thing I can do to help someone feel a little less alone, and to like represent in writing that it's okay to have these like unacceptable thoughts, you know, go through your head that you would feel ashamed about. It's that shame and loneliness that lead to those dark places.
Yeah, you know, there's one thing, and I don't know if Nicole or Shannon are tuning in, so I apologize if I embarrass them, but like Shannon and Nicole's writings make me want to be a better writer and a braver writer in terms of what I put out there. Reading Shannon's first book made me want to write about my adoptee experience. Reading Nicole's essays made me want to do that. So working on this project, you know, like, oh my God, like reading all these amazing stories and seeing more of my peers and the kidlit community like talking about being adopted made me want to get back and do it again. You know, I've been trying to write a middle grade book because of it. So like it's lit a little fire under me, which is really wonderful. And I know you were talking about it, but like I hope it does the same for kids who pick it up.
Thank you all so much. I saw a question in the back. All right, the very back.
Thank you all for writing in this anthology and also speaking tonight. This has been an amazing event. My question is similar, but what advice would you give to adoptee creators who want to create through their journey?
I think super importantly, which I was trying to sort of say in my last answer, is use the experience as a way to do something innovative, to say something innovative without even saying necessarily, I'm adopted so, because inherently your vision and your creativity is going to be informed by that and made even more powerful than that, than you might, I love to say, and it's important to say, we're more than our adoptive stories, because I think that people, non-adopted people, hear that and they're like, oh geez, here we go, adoption again, you're adopted, it's traumatic, blah blah blah. And you're like, kind of is. But if you use it, internalize it, and meld it with your skills and talents and vision, it can only knock it out of the park. You can only bring something that nobody else is going to bring.
I would say put us first. I think there's an instinct to kind of talk across the aisle, but there are plenty of those stories. And there's so few of these stories.
I would say don't be too stressed about trying to make it universal for everybody, right? I've made that mistake in my own writing where like written an adoptee book and I send it to a bunch of my adoptee friends as like sensitivity readers. I'm like, well, this isn't my experience, and this isn't my experience, and this isn't my experience. Every adoptee is different. We all have different experiences. So keep it as personal as you can, and it'll end up being very universal. Like reading all your stories, like, oh my God, like I felt so much in common with your stories, even though they were nothing like them, So yeah, be personal.
I would say just go for it. I've had my moments feeling like a fraud next to these seasoned writers, and this is definitely my very first thing. But it's like, just go for it and let your light shine. That's what my husband told me tonight when I told him I was nervous.
Thank you all. And put us first. I feel like I want this as a slogan, a huge banner over this event. I think a couple more questions. Yeah, in the plaid.
Hi, I came from Indiana to see you, and I was wondering if you could give me some voice and comfort. I know Eric just said that every adoption story is unique, and at the moment, I feel even more uniquely isolated because for the past 15 years, I have reclaimed my mother tongue, which is Korean. I was adopted at 11, so I spoke Korean till age 11. And then also my adoptive parents did not keep us, so I don't, that's not an issue, but I'm just giving you a little background. So because I'm fluent in Korean at this point, I'm good smoothly between Korean society and American society, but the culture is very different. And I've had some really bad experiences of Koreans knowing I was adopted, how they treated me when I thought they respected me. So now I never say, I don't even, we moved to Indiana 4 years ago, I don't even tell my doctor I'm adopted, okay, for medical reasons. Anyway, so I have Korean friends, they don't know I'm adopted, I feel like it's none of their business, but I feel just very isolated. I have a lot of friends, both societies, but I feel extremely uniquely isolated because I'm going between the two worlds. Can you please give me some words of comfort?
I have thoughts. First of all, that you were adopted at 11. That's a lot. Give yourself some grace around that, because that's a lot. We know the primal severance from a very young age, but at 11, that's a whole grown child. I would say also that you should maybe consider that your experience is yours to impart or to redefine as you want to, and to not fear people's judgment of you because it's actually irrelevant. You should find a way to engage in a, so that you feel not isolated, but unified with the kind of dichotomy, you know, this paradoxical existence. It's like the double consciousness that W.E.B. Du Bois talked about, and it's crazy making. And so I would say that you claim that the knowledge of having lived that way, and to trust your friends. If they're friends, they will honor you and they will support you. And if they don't, not so much friends.
You know, I guess I would add to that too, that writing, I think, is a way of finding, also a way of finding your people, right? And the last question kind of spoke to that, but I think if you, as you write about your experiences, you're also like, it's like a whale call, right? It's like you send out the vibrations and somewhere on the other side of the world, the whales hear it, and you're not alone. And so, I mean, I think just to keep writing and write about the things maybe that you feel like you can't talk about, you'll find community that way, I think.
And here, like, this is amazing. Look at all these wonderful people here, right? I know there's this wonderful organization, the also known as organization that you can potentially connect to. Like, I fully plan on embarrassing myself and asking for various phone numbers while I'm here and making some friends. So don't be afraid to say.
Yeah, I think for me, there's been this delineation between like ethnic community and adoptee community, and like the ethnic community, whether you'll be accepted or not, like the welcome is awesome. And then there's also the lack of welcome, which is just like, hey, that's their issue, not mine. Because in the greater scheme of things, like this is where I was actually physically born. Like I am a person who has a lineage, and like they can't deny that. And you know, but the adoptee community, like you will always belong, like 110, 50%, you know, and like I'm happy to give my email address to anybody, because I found it a little hard to get connected to the adoptee community at first. I would be that person in the Zoom room over in the pandemic being like, oh, do you want to connect outside of this? But yeah.
I do think, that's not fun. Okay. I do think, not to be negative Nelly, but that in terms of the adoption community, there is a difference between the transracial adoption community and the white adoptee community. Much has sort of gone towed that line of pretending that we're never adopted and not wanting to know that they were ever adopted. So I just think it's important to, and on top of that, yes, you're welcome, always welcome.
Yeah, in terms of that welcome too, before we do our last question, I wanted to ask everyone to raise their hands again if you're adopted, and then take a look so that we know who we're going to make friends with and connections with afterwards. Because as always, one of the reasons I wanted our panelists to talk a little bit about, like, how do you identify yourselves? I try whenever I'm in a group like this to say I'm a transracial adoptee, because I find people will find each other. People will come out of the woodwork and say, oh, me too, I'm adopted too. And then it's like, it builds and builds and builds. So please do mingle and meet everyone who you don't know in this room after this conversation. I saw that there was a question here in the like reddish, yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Heather, and thank you, Rebecca, thank you, Matthew, thank you, Eric, thank you, Lisa, so much for being with all of us today. Rebecca, what you shared with me, I was tearing up because I'm a new mom. My son is almost 6 months old, and this is the first time where I'm not going to be with him for bedtime. So this
that this event was important for me to come to, so everything that you have shared, like, I just, so thank you for completely meaning that. So I'm an inspiring memoirist, and I put my memoir on hold because I was afraid of sharing my story and offending my adopted family. So, and I've written some personal essays for NBC News about my journey as a pregnant adoptee. And I found that in order for me to write, I need to write from a filled space, not from an open wound. So I was wondering, how did all of you get into your space to write your stories? Thank you.
Girl, listen. I waited, as I said, until I had the absolute emotional fortitude and intellectual clarity and courage that comes with both of those things, because it is huge. And the fact that you're even still saying, I'm afraid of offending, you have to arrive at a place where that doesn't even occur to you, which isn't to say that it won't be challenging, particularly as a new mother. But that you're thinking about it, and that you're writing notes. It can take a long time to actually write it physically, but I think the main thing is emotional fortitude, intellectual clarity, squad, family, chosen family, and people who are going to lift you when the response comes.
I just want to thank you for being here tonight, because I know how hard it is to separate, like as an adoptee, how hard that is. So thank you for being here and for sharing.
Yeah, I guess for me, since I write books for kids, you're always trying to write from a place of hope, even when you're dealing with really heavy subjects. So like I can go in really angry about something and talk about that open wound, but since you're writing from a place of hope, you have to eventually get to that spot where it's at least somewhat healed. So I guess maybe that's not really a good answer, but like if you do decide to write in the YA space, sometimes you can go at it from that angry space and come out a little more whole.
I mean, you get that space. I don't know. Sometimes it's like stubbornness. I think actually a large part of it is stubbornness. But I also think there's this advice that I'm often giving to my students that is from Alexander Chi, where he says, you have a problem with the essay, write about the problem with the essay. And I think that can be applied to so many things, right? You're having trouble writing the memoir because you're afraid of, and write about writing, being afraid of writing, right?
I just wanted
Always
to say,
ready.
to build on that, which is that I was a columnist for The Guardian for 2 years before I was finally ready to actually write the proposal, and that's what I was doing. Like I was writing about the problem of not being ready to write a memoir. It was sort of like these sharp epistles that would come out about all the things that were going on in the world. So definitely write about how you're preparing yourself, and because that helps.
It's just so beautiful. And I really love what Eric said about finding a place of hope and writing in that place of hope. And I think, and I hope that this room right now, this event feels like a place of hope. And I think we can expand as we make connections here and expand those places of hopes and loop them all together and eventually be in a place where this is not quite as hard and it doesn't feel quite as tender every time you look at it. But this has just been so incredibly beautiful. Thank you all so much. Thank you all.